right away. First of all, I do want to wish you Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. I realize that the term Merry Christmas might be uh, unfavorable to some, but it's a statement of my faith in a way to let you know that I am of a Christian background. And I also wish you happy holidays, whatever faith community you're with, or none at all. Today we're going to be talking about the holidays here on Nycos, and I'm broadcasting in the tabletop channel because we're going to be doing most of the topics today actually on roleplay again, which is someplace that's very near and dear to my heart. I have more than 49 years of play experience as a storyteller and game master, and I really have developed a world mechanism that includes such things as holidays. And because we are nearing the Christmas holiday here in the United States, I also wanted to start in the same time frame. So the holidays that I'm going to talk about are 8 holidays spread over the Nycos year, but starting in this same time of year with the holiday known as Christmas. And Christmas is based on the concept of the item that has driven the story arc for Nycos iteration after iteration, which is an object known as the Dream Prism. And so the Christmas holiday is focused on that. There's a lot of various things that go into it, but the main concept of it is the celebration of the various colors of the spectrum and of light in general, and therefore it culminates with a day known as the Day of Brilliance, which we'll get to in a moment. Is actually also known as New Year's Day, but we'll get to that. The idea here is that the prismatic holiday, or the holiday of Christmas, recognizes the various colors of the order of veils: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, as well as black, white, and gray. And it also celebrates the concept of how these colors interrelate with each other, all culminating with the Day of Brilliance, which is also known as New Year's Day, where all of the colors are combined into a single brilliant light. So, what is New Year's Day? Well, New Year's Day is a holiday that I run games generally every New Year's Eve, New Year's Eve into New Year's Day, and we play for hours and hours and hours. And generally, these are periods of word plays, puns, and just enjoying laughter together. And so New Year's Day ties into that very well as a culmination of the 2 weeks of Christmas. The next holiday we're going to talk about is, it equates fundamentally to what we think of as the New Year's Day, but it actually refers to the beginning of the Nycos iteration, and that is the duodawn. It's the celebration of a twin sunrise when both Helios and Nimbus rise together in the heavens, and it is again culminating after New Year's Day. Duodawn is this day of recognizing the two solar bodies and how they impact the world of Nycos, and there are rituals and such that are involved with that, generally dealing with the rising of the suns on that particular day. The next holiday is further down in the year. It's about mid-year, and it is known as Founders Day, and it's actually a celebration of the enjoined. In the world of Nycos, as you play a character in the world, you are actually interacting as a being that lives in that world, and therefore you are enjoined, or there's an injunction between you and your persona that when you are there, you are playing the persona, and all the actions and decisions are made by you. And the rest of the time, when you're not there and time is passing by, the persona still has to do the things that is required of them for survival. So they have to eat, drink, all that kind of stuff. And therefore, the Founders Day is acknowledgement of the day that this injunction began, where players became actually living beings in the world of Nycos, and the interaction between the living and the persona as a player character and the persona as the NPC kind of merged together in this celebration. It's a way for players to actually interact with their multiple characters that are in different places in the world, can actually interact with each other and such. Creates for some great times of crossover episodes where players from one group might go and visit another group and things like that. The next one beyond that is equates to Our Halloween, and that's called All Hallows Eve, and it is a reference to a place where mystical things happen in Nycos, known as All Hallows, and the night of that is also a night of festivities in this world because it equates to the Halloween period of time, and I generally do a spooky or Halloween adventure to be timed with that. The next is slightly later in the year, approximating our Thanksgiving, but it's the Festival of the Forge, and this has to do with the holiday surrounding the creation of not only actual physical metals and alloys, but also of mystical alloys, where the concept is that magicals, the very material that causes magics to work, are forged into material to make magical items. And the Festival of the Forge is a celebration of new magic items, new interactions with the metals, and of recent years, the reawakening of the technomatons and the arrival of them into the world of Nycos as a player character race. Next is the Doomsday Marathon, and I call it the Doomsday Marathon mainly because it's usually a world-changing event that the players get involved with that requires a much longer period of time to play through. So we generally play it as a longer session, maybe 2 or 3 times a regular session. And back when I was younger, it would be a 24-hour game session where we would literally not sleep, but constantly play, eat, and play some more. And so the Doomsday Marathon continues, and it fundamentally is a place for the players to reminisce about the various monsters that they faced and to conjure up the feelings that they had in those situations, and also to create new memories with new monsters and new interactions that they may not have engaged with before. And then finally, the last holiday of the year, if you will, for the Nycos is the Feast of the Exchange. And this generally is an actual physical event where I invite players and honored guests to my house, and we actually do a kind of a potluck, kind of a meal event where we exchange information about the games, but we also tend to bring books to share or trade with each other that either we have no longer have a use for or whatever, and so we actually physically trade books. Oftentimes it's also associated with characters in the game who have in the story collected items, books, literature that they wish to share with the others, and therefore many times fan fiction will be written about the world of Nycos and be added to literally the book collection in the world of Nycos. If you want to know more about that, you can check out the book collections over at NycosRPG.info and look up under the book section there, and you can find out more about the writings of Nycos. All right, so this has covered the holidays, and of course this has to do with the games are the reason for the season, and that's the truth for every season. So getting together and playing role-play games is critical to the world as we know it. So there you go. And I realized I'm not watching my clock very well, so I'm probably running right through my commercials. So I apologize for that. So now we're going to go through. Ooh, wrong camera. Did it again. This camera. All right. So we're going to be talking about the trigger list. And what I refer to as the trigger list are the different players that kind of set me on edge or cause gameplay to be challenging or confusing and such. So I want to kind of share this with you so you get an idea of what kind of things that you as a player want to consider, or more importantly, you as a game master might have seen these same personas. If you have other personas than the ones that I've come up with, feel free to put those in the comments section here in the chat. I'd be glad to speak with you about it there as well. But we're going to talk first of all about action magnets. And an action magnet is a person who doesn't understand the boundaries of physically where they are in the game and literally wants to be the part of every spoken scene in the game. So they literally will follow one player's action, want to respond to that, and then move over to another player and try to respond to that. And this action magnet literally draws them into the action, even though they're physically not capable of being there or may not be privy to the conversation or whatever. And an action magnet can be problematic, and it generally is a new player who doesn't understand the protocols of how games work, and they simply want to be a part of all of the action. And it also tends to be younger players rather than older players because most people have a concept of timing and location, but it's not always the case. And an action magnet simply hasn't learned those uh, boundaries and limitations yet. And so it's important that when you have an action magnet in your group, that you educate them and guide them to participate when they're actually in the scene and to vicariously enjoy the scene while they're not. The next are the analyzer paralyzers, and these are the guys that they so analyze, they go through what they call analysis paralysis. They simply have too many variables and they don't know what the limits are, what they can or can't do, and so therefore they start to freeze up when they're trying to determine what's going to be done. Now, here in a minute, I'll go over the ways you handle it, but generally, in the case of a person who has analysis paralysis, you might want to provide them with alternatives, might want to suggest some things to them. This is a far cry, of course, from the ring in the nose kind of railroading. It's literally a matter of making them aware of what kind of possibilities so that they have less difficulty in determining which action they want to take. It also may be a situation where their analysis paralysis literally because they're getting in too many variables and they can't make a decision, in which case you need to give them more time. And we're going to how you do that when we get down here a little bit further. We have another one that's similar. So the next one are the escapists. And an escapist generally plays role-play games for a very different style of play, wherein they perceive of the universe as something to test and to challenge. And perhaps they see they see their character's role as not being associated with a life in the world of Nycos, but simply are trying to see what the limits and boundaries of the game are. And again, it tends to be newer players rather than veterans, but a veteran can fall into this trap, if you will, if they often get away with making crazy decisions and the game master can roll with it. While there are some storytellers that prefer that, in my estimation, an escapist story breaker is literally attempting to derail the primary story in favor of doing a crazy action or convincing the players to do something that would not be in keeping with the personas. So you have to kind of work with them to try to figure out how better to bring them into the story and prevent this. Generally, it's early on in a campaign when a player doesn't know what the limits are or when they are new to the play style. And of course, that will always vary with each game master. And so a player like this might fit perfectly into your campaign as is, whereas in mine, it's a pet peeve of mine if a player doesn't figure out that they are actually alive in the game and that they are affecting that person's livelihood when they're not when they are not in the game. The next one is perhaps a little bit more locally focused in that it has to do with the Dungeons and Dragons 5e mechanism wherein you build a character's backstory. Historically, it's the game master's bailiwick to develop the story behind the characters, but it's a mechanism in Dungeons and Dragons 5e in order to drive players to collect skills and abilities. And while it is not a bad thing, the issue is that many of the players will build their backstory so completely out that there are no smooth edges. There are no prickly parts. There's no uncertainty that can be hooked in or anchored into the story as the game master has perceived of it, and therefore it's difficult to merge them into the story stream because there's nothing out there out hanging that can be linked onto it. Instead, it's nice and coherent, and they've solved all the problems that the character has within the build. going to commercial. Just a moment. 17 seconds. So thank you for watching thus far. And if you stick with me through the break, we'll be continuing our list of the 10 rants about players. I'm Jonathan Alvin. This is Nycos RPG. I don't know how long it's going to last. We have to see here. I think it's going to kick over. It's been 2 minutes. I don't know. We're going to go ahead and continue. Alrighty. So there we go. Test. Test. Testing 1, 2. Can you hear me now? Okay. Alrighty, so we are back and we are talking about backstories. The reason why characters with smooth backstories are a challenge is that they're not readily and easily transmissible into the storyline that the game master has already devised. And so therefore it's important to make your story feel a little bit more edgy so they can be connected better. And so the idea of ultra smooth backstory just makes it difficult for a player to be incorporated so that they feel part of the story since they've already built all of the concepts behind them and linked them all back together. Next pet peeve I have is the quick question interrupter. And it's not so much about being interrupted because that's already problematic. I mean, if I'm working with player B and we're going through something that happens in his story, and then player A or C comes over and says, "Oh, quick question, Game Master, can I do this?" It breaks the concentration, it breaks the scene, interrupts the story, and it deprives player B of the time that they should have had to be able to shine in the story. So the idea of the quick question is really more of a problem of the phraseology because a person who uses the phrase quick question generally is trying to be polite, but often the question that they want to ask is actually rather extreme in length and has more to it. The idea of a quick question interrupter, therefore, is somebody who is not necessarily yet familiar with the decorum of roleplay, where you do allow each player to have amount of time and acknowledge the questions that players have in between those scenes. But when it's actually going on, a quick question interrupter actually breaks with the scene, and that's kind of a problem. Next are the corrections officers, and I have nothing bad to say about people who are in that field, so don't think that I'm referring to people who actually are in law enforcement and are correction officers. What I'm referring to in this case are players who have a perception of how the game should be played and are interfering with another player or are critical of the style of play that other players bring to the table. And so a corrections officer, they may even be doing it, from the standpoint of being helpful to assist a player who is new in the nuances of play. But generally speaking, a corrections officer is really almost usurping game master authority in telling the players what they can do or what they shouldn't be able to do, and that's kind of a problem. The corrections officer theoretically should be only can be concerned with their own play style and how they are playing into the characters than how other people are doing. And so a corrections officer usually has to be advised to stay within their lane and their persona and let other players play. The next are the egregious dice fudgers. And there are times when I'm sure every player has either been tempted or has actually indeed given into the temptation to say they rolled a 20 when they rolled a 19 or a 14 or a 12. But the point here is that an egregious dice fudger is someone who is constantly having to succeed at their die rolls. I've actually had one person in a game with a straight face while rolling a blind telling the group that his dice rolls were 15 or better 20 plus times in a row. And while there are runs of positive die rolls that can go, a considerable number of times, nonetheless, by the 15th or 20th time, you're pretty aware that the person is improvising the dice rolls. And while it seems like a problematic one, it's actually easily resolved in the case of a live stream game, because I utilize Discord, and in Discord there are dice rolling bots that you can use that provide the random number generation effect of a dice roll, and therefore can't be fudged, so to speak, and it can't be modified. And the players are aware of it and can use it. In the tabletop, it's a little more difficult, but what I generally do is I put out a die rolling surface in the middle of the table and require all critical dice rolls to the game to be rolled in the clear, meaning other players can see the dice rolls, and the dice have to remain on the table until two or more people, or the roller and at least one other person, has verified the die rolls. It's not really a problem. I mean, there are times when a player just simply is afraid of losing, but the reality is that kind of shows the player's trust or distrust of the game master if he can't let the story roll according to the dice as they fall. So having a person that is an egregious die roller can be problematic, not for themselves, because the game master can work with anything, but more importantly, it undermines the credibility of the game master if everybody else can see that this one player is being rather egregious about it. So you want to try to limit that if you can. The next are what I call the Monopoly players, and the Monopoly player is not necessarily playing the game of Monopoly. What I'm referring to is that they have almost a manic need to be in the center of attention of the game sessions. Perhaps they see themselves as the game group's spokesman or chief advisor, and therefore they believe everything that they say should be canon, and the other players should fall into line with that. Or perhaps they talk over other players to get their words heard. But in any case, the Monopoly player, especially Monopoly driver, is one who is monopolizing the time of the game, therefore depriving other players of their liberties and freedoms. We'll talk more about that, and we have talked about that before when I've talked about inclusion and equity in roleplay. The next are the repeat offenders. And again, I'm not speaking of somebody who breaks one of the rules or violates one of the policies or whatever more than one time. That's not what I'm referring to. What I'm referring to is the person who basically requires do-overs when they do something in the game that fails. They walk across a room, they get heard, so they immediately want to repeat the scene and say, well, I really didn't walk across loudly because I'm skilled and I would be aware and blah, blah, blah. They were looking for a chance at a redo because something didn't go favorably for them. And once in a while, again, a reinterpretation of something can occur when the game master wasn't clear about the setting or whatever. But generally speaking, a person who is constantly falling back to this is a challenge because you have to get them to see that once they've made a decision, then the game master is going to go with it and just move on from there. Of course, in the case of Nycos, you do have the blessing point mechanism that allows you to get additional re-rolls and things like that. And it's not quite the same as this. But what I'm referring to those who literally want to redefine the way they did something in a different set of words to get a replay of the scene. A group that really is not so much of a problem for me as a game master, but for other people, and I've definitely seen a lot of it. That is the game player who is a spoiler or wants to take on the role of a prophet. Now, what I mean by this is, for example, a person who is a game master in their own right. They come and play at your table, and when you start to describe a monster, they fill in the other players on how to counter the monster, only because they, as a game master, have played with the monster before, not that their persona would have had any interaction with it. And this creates a spoiler environment if you're especially trying to introduce new players to the monsters of the game, and they have their experience messed with because now they know stuff that their character knows stuff that their player shouldn't yet be aware of, and you take away part of the fun. Furthermore, it creates a false prophet situation where if they give a description for the monster that isn't accurate, they're now interfering with the success of the other players by being absolutely certain that the monster will be played in thus in such a way. And this leads to problems of credibility, not only for them as players, but for you as a game master, if you allow those moments to play out on a regular basis. So make sure that you're dealing with a false prophet the way that most false prophets should be dealt with. That is, say you don't know what you're talking about, we're going to move on. The next are, some people call them wallflowers. I prefer to call them slowpoke McGillicuddies because it's not that they don't have the information to make a decision. They just have chosen to be deliberate, perhaps over deliberate about making their decisions, or they always wait till other players have made decisions so they can piggyback their actions onto those of other players. And part of that again is being new. You're not wanting to rock the boat. You're not sure what you really can or can't do, and so you're depending on other players to help you or guide your decision making. But a slowpoke McGillicuddy can drag a game down and slow things down if they are taking more time than a person in the actual situation would take to make a decision. So it's a matter of education, awareness of what they can and can't do, and sheer time in game for them to overcome this. The last one I'm going to mention are the Thunder Thieves. And this actually was stemmed from a conversation where the players were actually in a store that was selling gag gifts, and one of the gag gifts in there were cans of thunder. And so one player bought a can of thunder. The next player asked what he wanted in the store. He says, I'll have 2 of those. The idea is they're literally stealing the thunder of another player. This occurs in game when player A says he wants to check out a chest, and then player 3 says, oh, I want to do that too. And then when it comes down to the die rolling, player 1 may have been unsuccessful in opening the chest, but player 3, since he's doing exactly what the other person does, rolls, makes a success, and now he's stolen the thunder from the person that actually had the idea in the first place. So there are mechanisms that a game master can invoke, like first one that it says it does it, and the second one has to choose something else, or you can narratively figure out how to make it work. But the idea is that you want to prevent one player from upstaging or stealing the thunder of another simply because they have the opportunity based on the die rolls and their initiative. So that's all I'm going to say about that, as the saying goes. So now, let's switch over here and talk a little bit about some time-saving tips for a game master. If you watched my video about an hour ago, I didn't have the sound on, so I apologize. So this is a replication. I'm Game Master Jay, and we're talking about some storyteller shortcuts, time-saving tips for game masters. First one I want to talk about is you want to condense your materials to make it easier for you to handle them. So I recommend putting story elements on 3x5 cards. Maybe it's a setting, maybe it's a location, maybe it's a climatological thing, maybe it's climatological. The idea is to have these story elements on 3x5 cards so you can make note of it, describe it, and set it aside so you can get through the various scenes in rapid succession and move from one to the other. A second thing to have is a convenient list of NPC names. And if you're in a urban setting, I recommend having a multiplicity of them because you'll have different, for example, certain cultural naming conventions. You might have 3 or 4 names that are of a different species that you might need to have handy. And the idea is to have those lists already prepped so that you can simply look to a note and blurt it out rather than have to, in the case of running a game live, having to go and look up a website where you can find a random generator, blah, blah, blah. So the idea is that you want to have those names prepped so that the players can interact even with personas that you expected to be window dressing. Maybe you mention something in passing, but the players find that person to be fascinating, so they want to go and talk with them, and now you'll have a name for them. The idea of having it already prepped is that you're able to more rapidly move seamlessly into each interaction. This third one is more for people who prefer to run pre-generated adventures, what they used to call modules, or the book versions of campaigns and such. Make sure you pre-read your materials as necessary beforehand so that you're familiarized. By having a pre-read and an awareness of the setting and the scenes, your delivery will be more efficient. You'll be able to answer questions more rapidly, and you won't have to spend a lot of time looking things up, which detracts from the speed of the game and also undermines some of your credibility as a game master because you're going to be perceived as depending on the book for answers to questions. This next one is particularly for crunchy games such as Dungeons & Dragons 5e or Pathfinder, where there are a lot of rules requirements. Make sure that you've already set up one thing you can do is have a sheet of pre-rolled dice values of each denomination. So you got a page of 100s and a page of D6s and a page of D8s or whatever, so that as you're resolving attack values for, say, 4 or 5 monsters at a time, you can look across there and just line out the die rolls as you use them, and then apply the results as if you had physically just rolled them. And it makes it so that the game master's time of doing the mechanics of the game is cut down considerably. Granted, the players have to choose which of the villains they're going to fight or whatever, but if you're having them fight hordes of monsters, then the hordes of monster die rolls should be more quickly handled, and so therefore having pre-rolled numbers makes that a breeze. In like fashion, if you are playing a game where your scenes are generic and random and the locale is not particularly well known by the players, having some pre-created battle mats or maps are indispensable, especially if you're like I am. I've got 3 or 4 of these large-scale map books so that I can, at a moment's notice, have an oceanfront scene or perhaps a deep jungle or even a city block. This idea of having it pre-created maps means that you could drop it on the table and just go to town with your players using their miniatures or tokens or whatever to show where they are so that they can have a better idea of what their options are. Now, this is not always the case. I prefer theater of the mind, but especially with newer players, it's sometimes easier to have a map so they can physically see where they are. It also tends to help with, in particular, the action magnets that I spoke of earlier, that if you're utilizing the map mechanism, you can simply point there over there and the actual actions over here, and therefore give them the opportunity to become more aware of situational awareness. Another fun thing to do that I would highly recommend that makes your games go faster is have handouts of the poems, poetry, or puzzles, prompts that you have for the players, because then they have a tangible piece to look at and to hold in their hand. And if you've created a specific map, or for example, and you've provided to them as a rolled up scroll, then they get to interact with it as if it was that item, which makes the role play a little bit more rich, a little bit more tangible. And also, by having multiple copies of the riddles or poems, then the players can look at it at their leisure and not have to keep arguing it between themselves about who has it or who's carrying it at this moment, which again tends to break up the flow of your game sessions. Another thing that's really useful to have is player table tents and a means of marking their initiative. I use, for example, I use playing cards where I'll have a set of, say I've got 6 players, I'll have 6 cards numbered 1 through 6, and then the players can just lay that out beside their table tent and will know what their order is. This is particularly handy in roleplay games like Dungeons and Dragons, where the initiative is set for the entire afternoon with the first die roll. Or you can actually pull the cards back, shuffle them up, and just hand them out. And therefore, you get it done in a relative hurry, and you can get on to the action of the round by simply calling out the first player and getting their action. When you do these two, they tend to make it so the players use the persona name and get familiar with who's playing whom, and it also gives the idea of first, second, third, and therefore it cuts down on the amount of analysis paralysis or the thunder stealers, we get thunder thieves, because they can see who's going next and what action's been done, and therefore they can pick their next action in a quicker way. Also helps with your slowpoke McGillicuddies, because they'll have all the time up until their initiative to make their decisions. The final one I want to talk about is to have a short run sandglass. And I think the one I took was from a Boggle game or whatever. They have a 3-minute or 5-minute counter that you can literally turn over and watch the sand fall, so that a player is aware of how limited their time is, and therefore they trigger their actions and decisions much more quickly, and also provides them with the kind of the built-in stressor of the time being short, and therefore they have to be considering all options. Really, what it comes down to is that if you utilize time savings tips, then you're going to have more game time overall for every player. As I've said before, you want to have equitable time play, and using a sandglass for each player tends to give you a rhythm to the session. All right, so apparently I talked right through my own session there, so I'm going to go back and mention the last two. Player table tents are really important because they give you a way for the players to get to know each other's character names. And it also, if you initiate also an initiative marker system, you can determine who's going first, second, third in a turn more easily by having these physical markers that can be laying in front of the players to make it more recognizable and understandable. And then finally, having a sandglass and a little timer, 3-minute timer, 5-minute timer, can allow the players to feel the stresses of needing to act more quickly, because you're only allotting them a certain amount of time to make their decisions. But it also feels more tangible to feel rushed and moving through things. And especially if you've got a combination of analysis paralysis and slowpoke McGillicuddies, you can actually get past both of them by having a sandglass that monitors the amount of time they have to make decisions. And all of this really comes down to the fact that time savings means more game time. If you have things that are delaying your sessions and you're able to avoid them using some of these recommendations, then you're going to have more time per night and get more actions and more turns through in the game. All right, so now we're going to switch gears a bit. We're going to talk a little bit about the Nycos Launchpad, and we're going to talk about how you merge the concept of chain storming with the domino wall. To give quick context, a chain storm is the process by which you come up with ideas in a rapid fashion and then link them together to create chains so that you get an idea of timing and sequencing of the things you want to accomplish within your chain storm. The domino wall is the principle that the items that you come up with, once you've determined a chronological time, that you build out this wall as different things that are going to happen at different times, but then you begin to put pressure on each one of them a little at a time so that they all start to lean towards the successive completion of them, so that the pressure of each one will cause the others to be more likely. And this, we're going to talk about how you do this. And the first thing you're going to want to do is keep your chain storms singular in nature. Pick out one subject you're going to resolve by it. Don't try to think of fixing the world all at once, but instead choose a specific issue, and then you use the chain storm mechanism to try to decide how to go from where you are now to the completion of that objective. And each piece of chain gets linked to the like ideas. Then the chronology is determined as far as first, second, third, fourth, and then you overlay the different pieces of the chain in ways that make sense for you. Maybe they are absolutely linear and they go 1 through 10. Perhaps they're merged together. Maybe 2 or 3 of one are ahead of the other, and so on. And the idea here is that by having a singular issue, you're able to isolate and focus, which makes your chain storm more direct and more complete. Second thing is to keep to that topic. Yes, every subject that you name could have 50 interpretations. Just realize that when you chose your topic, you were picking a specific focus, and then stay on that focus as you move through the chain storm. The next is chain storms can be time consuming, and so set for yourself a limit. If you're going to chain storm for an hour, then only do so for 60 minutes, and then you conclude with your chain storm with what pieces you have at that point. Perhaps it's not complete, perhaps you've got more to add to it, or it didn't reach the final objective. Great, just set another point of time to do the chain storm. But don't feel that you have to complete an entire process alpha to Z in the same day or the same hour. The next thing is to prioritize the chain pieces in a chronological order. So once you do have them laid out, you know this one has to happen before that one, has to happen before that one. But you then can nest them as appropriate. In certain cases, you might be working on 2 or 3 of them at the same time. In other cases, you might have them all spread out. The idea is to prioritize them by time, because then you can actually choose which one you're going to do first, second, third. And that helps to prioritize the mind. The next thing is you want to clarify and quantify each step as you go. So your chain storm can be broad, but it needs to be concise as well. So you're going to determine unique steps, unique items to put into that list so that you can judge which one has a higher priority when it comes down to that. Once you've done that, once we've completed the chain storm, next part is to build a domino wall. And fundamentally, if you've ever played with dominoes, you know what I'm talking about, where you stand them on end close enough together that they're going to topple each other in a sequence. Well, your chronology of your chain storm, which is out there ephemeral in the air, now becomes something you can see linearly from beginning to end, and then you stack them so that they are in an order that will complement one another. When you do this, then you want to commit to working a little bit on each step each day, because once you have this nice logical domino course, then certainly things that need to happen first are going to be higher priority at least at the beginning. But as you build out and you work on each one of them a little bit, they all start to lean a little bit until such time as that one of them reaches terminal break point, and then its action is going to cause the next step to be higher priority and also more likely to be concluded. And this process of dominoes allows you to set up a plan so that you are now ready to prepare to act on the entire process when the dominoes begin to fall, because you'll be able to see which ones are delayed and which ones are already enacted, and by working on them a little bit each day, you're already aware of what's going to be needed for them to be completed. The point here is that the success becomes inevitable when you've thought through your chain storm, you've built a nice linear course, and then you follow that course to its completion by focusing on the chain all to pieces at the same time, a little bit each day. Alrighty, and this is a topic that, going back to role-play games, one of the biggest challenges to a game master is how do you keep players in your game week after week, month after month, year after year. The Nycos campaign arc is generally 6 years long, and so like many players feel daunted by that. But the challenge is that if you follow these guidelines, you're going to make it feel like it's so natural that they'll simply continue and they won't even realize how much time has passed, and they'll be able to conclude. So the first thing you want to do is have a variety of experiences. Be aware of the classic trope of knock down the door, take the monster's treasure, gain your experience, and move on. But also realize there are puzzles that you could do. There are riddles that could happen. Could be some mystery. Try to mix it up a little bit and play a few of each type over time. Maybe there are ones that you're really good at and you'd like to do them all the time because it's really easy for you, but you need to mix it up because the players may have found that that one isn't what they necessarily want to do every week. So mix it up, come up with a variety of player experiences. I've got an entire video on those, and you'll be able to find those once I link them up, once I finish the video. But the second is to look at the level of perceived danger and the management of the dangers in your sessions. If every week your players are terrified they're going to die, that kind of pressure is not something that they're necessarily going to like all the time. And even if that was, you still want to mix it up a little bit because it's more challenging when you're not certain. So therefore, have a mixture and holding on to the perception of danger. I jokingly say that if I haven't put at least one player into a near-death experience, I haven't done my job. But that's not always the case. But generally speaking, you want to have a perception of the danger so that the players don't become complacent or think that they can run roughshod over the story or the NPCs that you develop. Next is you want to build a narrative that is not only believable, but visceral. The players can feel it, whether it be maybe you drop some names from their family or you suggest some cultural link or whatever. When you build the story out, you want it to feel real so that the players will want to engage with it. Because most of us are more interested in a story that has to do with ourselves than we do with stories that have to do with other people. And so, although it's kind of nice to say, well, go save the princess, the reality is that most players want to save themselves or get themselves out of trouble. This also means that your descriptions of locales, especially like scene settings, needs to be panoramic and visual. So you want them to be able to perceive of how far away is the shovel sticking in the dirt, or how many yards to the fence line, so they can determine whether they want to run and jump it. These kind of visual descriptions provide a richer experience for the players, and it also gives a better place for them to push back into the story and make part of it their own. A critical skill that a game master needs to develop is the idea of interpreting the dice rolls. Yes, it's easy to say, well, you rolled against a number and you missed. You rolled against a number and you hit. Your weapon does this kind of damage. But those terms are player terms. They're not persona terms. So learn how to interpret the die rolls in the context of what's going on in the game. Now, the NycosRPG mechanism is built for this with the idea of partial successes and full successes, so the players can instantaneously see whether they did as well or better than their opponent. But the idea of then interpreting the dice into the narrative makes it feel more real, and therefore the players will embrace the games more readily and want to be more a part of the story because they will feel and see in their mind's eye the things that are happening. And for those that have aphasia, they'll certainly be able to have a better understanding of the physical displacement they are with the items in the milieu and or the distances they have to travel within the scene. This next one is kind of a funny place to go, but player inclusion and inequity. And in here, I'm not necessarily talking about the kinds of issues that our culture talks about today, but the idea of player inclusion and equity means that you're giving every player at the table a chance to shine, to have narrative, to have dialogue, to feel the threats and dangers, but you're also providing them with equity, that you're giving them a fair shake and you're playing to their strengths and you're playing within the framework that you've built in a way that they all feel like they're part of the group. A fun one here is also to consider building skills that will keep players on task. For example, if the adventure is meant to have them travel across country to do something, certainly a riding skill on some kind of animal becomes useful. Perhaps they want to build a new skill of endurance running, parkour, or whatever. You want to make sure that the skills availability makes it fit into what the tasks at hand are for the characters, so that the game feels like it makes sense. The idea that if you have a treatise that they can get a hold of that is the ins and outs of an ancient culture's tea ceremony, that's far less palatable than perhaps a skill on how to read the people in a room or whatever. And so make sure that your skills keep the players on the tasks, not only that you want them on, but the ones that they've stated that they want to be on, so that their advancement will feel more natural and somewhat homogenous, because they're able to just add whatever skills they want to along the process. In addition to that, you really have to be the master of the game. And for this, you have to look to several different things. You do have to know the rule system that you're playing under. You need to understand the protocols of communication, the idea of sharing time and letting each person speak, perhaps working on the tendency we have in our culture to speak over each other and basically guide the players to be better, more kind and courteous players. Because when you're the master of the game, players want to come back and enjoy that experience because it's not as chaotic or frustrating as perhaps another storyteller. The next thing you want to do is as you're running your games, especially with players that have skills and experience in roleplay, ask a leading question. Ask open questions. If you've got a player who's a little confused or a little doubting of what they can or can't do, then you ask leading questions. But choosing which one is actually the skill. You determine whether or not you should be guiding a player to make a decision or allowing them to literally choose their own path. And by choosing to use either leading questions in the first case or open questions in the latter, you're going to have a better play experience because the players are going to be getting what they want out of the sessions. That, of course, means you have to go to the next part, which is being a good listener and responding well to feedback. If a player feels frustrated, respond to the frustration and clear the issue. If they are if they are wanting to know more information, perhaps you haven't described well enough, listen and therefore respond with feedback. This is also to make sure that you also have a rather tough skin, because sometimes a player says something that is caustic. Perhaps they didn't mean it the way you took it, and therefore you have to be a good listener to be able to respond appropriately to the feedback. Of course, in all of this, I know that I ramble quite a bit, but the focus should be on fun, of course. If you are playing a game and it's a burden, and if you play a game and the players are not having fun, they're not going to continue. So if you want a long-term campaign, you got to focus on the fun. Make sure you've got some clever bits, some funny bits, some dramatic bits, and some danger. These are all things that the players are seeking because they're wanting to play a role-play game. And then finally, in any session where you're going to be telling stories or running a game, you need to put in some work. I have several players that have commented on the difference of being in a game that I'm administering, where I've done some of the background legwork and built out the physical portion of the game. Whereas other game masters, they will say things like they phoned it in, like they weren't engaged and they didn't do any effort. And I'm as guilty as anyone else that sometimes I will feel the proclivity to phone it in or play on autopilot. But the reality is that a game session that is going to be dynamic and draw more people, more players in, is going to be one wherein you've done some of the effort of bringing the game to the people in a way that they would enjoy. And finally, I want to thank you for playing, whether you're playing in my games online or whether you're playing at your local game store. The community of role-play gamers greatly appreciate you being here. If you like the video, make sure you follow us here on Twitch. If you want more information, check out our YouTube page. I'm going to give you the page with all the information in a second. But I just wanted you to know how much I appreciate you being here, and hope that I'll see you again in another video. As I said, if you're looking for information on the Nycos RPG actual game, check out NycosRPG.com, which has product info and merchandising. You can also go to NycosRPG.info for information on the story, lore, and so much more. We'd also invite you to join our Discord, which is available down below this screen right here on Twitch. And you can join us via audio in that fashion, and also get an opportunity to check out the notes from our games groups. For more information on the campaigns itself, do check out my other videos here on Twitch and also at NycosRPG in YouTube. And finally, if you want to be a part of our community, you can join us directly at